Solitary confinement. Anne and Todd were still in bed when I walked into the kitchen on Saturday morning. My parents were sitting at the table with their coffee mugs. I could tell they had been waiting for me. I didn't like this part of the plan. This part of the plan was going to be pretty hard on Mom and Dad. And so were some other parts. It wasn't really fair to them, but it couldn't be helped. After all, I wasn't the one who had made up all the rules around here. Mom didn't even say good morning. She said, "We opened your report card last night, Nora." My dad shook his head and growled, "Never seen such bad grades in my life, even on my report cards." I said, "I don't want to talk about it. You saw the grades. I got D's and 1C. Those are my grades. I don't want to talk about it." "Nora, please," Mom said. "There must be a reason you got such awful grades. Are you unhappy? Have the children at school been teasing you? Have you been feeling sick, or is it something else?" I shook my head as I scanned the row of cereal boxes on the counter. I poured some cornflakes into a bowl and said, "I don't want to talk about it, Mom. I got the grades I got, and that's all there is to it." Dad exploded. "All there is to it? Well, then you're grounded, young lady, and that's all there is to it. You don't want to spill the beans and let us help you out? Then that's the way it is. You can just sit in your room until you decide to cooperate." I munched my cereal, swallowed, and took a sip of orange juice. I said, "Fine by me." Then I said, "Am I allowed to read, or do I have to sit in the corner and look at the flowers on the wallpaper?" Which was a lot sassier than usual, but that was part of the plan, too. Mom put a hand on Dad's arm. She said, "Nora, don't be disrespectful. You know better than that, and you know us better than that, too. We only want to help you. But first, you've got to help us." I looked at them. "But I don't want any help. Did I ask you to come to school and take my tests for me? Did I ask you to read my assignments for me or do my homework? I don't need help." They didn't talk anymore, and neither did I. After my last spoonful of cereal, I tipped up my bowl and drank the milk. I wiped the milk off my upper lip, laid my napkin on the table, got up and put my bowl and spoon and glass into the dishwasher. Then I said, "I'll be up in my room." I spent the rest of Saturday reading the article on the history of China in the Britannica. It was a long article, about 500,000 words. I'd been chipping away at it for almost a week, and I was only up to AD 1368, the beginning of the Ming Dynasty. It felt good to have some forced reading time. I was allowed out of my room for meals, and on Sunday morning I went to church with everyone, but then it was right back to my cell. At about 8 o'clock on Sunday night, my mom came in and sat down on the edge of my bed where I was reading. I knew why she'd come. It was time to get ungrounded. The way I figured, unless you're a teenager with places to go and friends to go with and money to spend, when you get there, grounding is a pretty pointless punishment. And sure enough, Mom's first words were, "Nora, your father and I have decided that your grounding is over. But I don't want you to think we're not concerned about this. This isn't like you, Nora." I looked up from my book. "Isn't like me? What am I like?" My mom smiled. "Why, you're sweet and thoughtful, and you want to do your very best at everything, Nora. That's what you're like." I gave a little snort, but Mom ignored the noise. "And if you need help," she continued, "you're smart enough to ask for it." "I told you, Mom, I don't need any help. And since when have I been sweet or thoughtful?" Mom stayed focused on her main topic. "But there's nothing wrong with asking for help. We all need help now and then. Besides, you don't want to get a reputation for not caring about your work. Grades are very important, Nora, so whether you like it or not, first thing tomorrow morning, your father and I are going to school to talk with Mrs. Hackney. It's just not right that a perfectly normal student would be allowed to get all D's and 1C. And your father and I did not get a single academic warning letter from the school, not one. The school has some explaining to do." She paused, her eyes searching my face. "You understand, don't you, Nora? We're not trying to embarrass you, but we have to get to the bottom of this." I shrugged and said, "Sure, I understand." And I did. I had been certain they would visit the school after they saw those grades. Mom stood up and started to leave, but she stopped at the door, turned back, and said, "Your dad and I love you, Nora." I looked up and I said, "I love you too." And that was a fact. But as I lay there in my bed, I wondered if my mom would still be able to say that in a week or two. This is a good time to stop and pause and talk about what just happened with the mom, or write some notes down, and then you can continue. We'll continue with chapter 6 after you pause. Stakeout. So, are you grounded like forever? That was Stephen's first question when we met at the bus stop Monday morning. He could have tried to telephone on Saturday or Sunday. He didn't call me very often these days, and it was usually just to ask about homework. No, I said, I'm not grounded. Not anymore. But my mom and dad are going to talk to the principal this morning, so stay tuned. I don't get it, Stephen said. How you got such rotten grades? You never do worse than me. I ignored his bad grammar and shrugged. Well, I did this time. I could tell he had more questions, but Lee and Ben came whooping down the street, and Ben shouted, Hey, Stephen, guess what? I got $40 for my grade, so I got the new Sims game. And it was like I had disappeared. That was the other thing about fifth grade. Stephen didn't even try to include me when his guy friends were around. But I didn't make it into a big deal. Besides, I had plenty to think about on my bus ride to school. My first period class was language arts, and every other Monday, Mrs. Noyes took us to the library. Our media center was right across the hall from the main office, so I grabbed a copy of Time and got a chair with a clear view of the entrance hall. I pretended to read, but I was on stakeout duty. At 9:07, my mom and dad showed up. I saw Mrs. Hackney come out of her office and shake hands with each of them. Then they followed her back inside and her door shut behind them. At 9:14, the intercom in the library chimed, and the school secretary's voice said, Mrs. Noyes, please come to the main office. Mrs. Noyes walked across the hall, and the secretary steered her into the principal's office. At 9:16, Mrs. Noyes hurried out of the office and down the hall toward her classroom. Less than a minute later, she was back, still hurrying, and she had something in her hand. It was her green grade book. I had a pretty good idea what was going on in the principal's office. At 9:23, my parents left. I ducked behind my magazine in case they looked my way. Then it was all clear. When Mrs. Noyes came back into the library, I kept my eyes on the page in front of me, but I had good peripheral vision. Mrs. Noyes looked right at me, a long, slow look. Then she went into the librarian's office. She shut the door and started talking to Mrs. Byrne. When I glanced up a minute later, they were both looking at me. By fourth period math, Mrs. Noyes must have already talked to Mrs. Zhang, because after we went over the homework, Mrs. Zhang looked right at me and said, Nora, are you sure you understand this? And when she assigned our new work, Mrs. Zhang came over and asked me to do 2 problems while she watched. She had never done that before. It was like that all day. All my teachers paid more attention to me, sort of checking up on me all the time, and I understood exactly why. Most kids think that if they get bad grades, it's their problem, but that's not true. The fact is, when a kid gets a bad grade, it's like the teacher is getting a bad grade too, and the principal, and the whole school, and the whole town, and the whole state. And don't forget the parents. A bad grade for a kid is a bad grade for everybody. After school, I hurried to the media center because I wanted to get there before all the computers got reserved. I had been staying after school for the extended day program since first grade, and I could either go to the gym or the library. I almost always went to the library. Stephen did the extended day program too because both his parents worked, same as mine, but he only went to the library once in a while. No one was using my favorite computer over in the corner, so I sat down and punched in my password. When the system recognized me, I opened up the internet browser, went to Google, and typed in Connecticut Mastery Testing. There were a ton of web pages, and I found my favorite one. It listed 9 ways the state should improve the CMT. I'd been online for about 3 minutes when Mrs. Byrne came walking toward me, so I switched screens to a kid's page about ocean currents. I didn't want her to know the kind of research I was doing. Mrs. Byrne smiled and said, Nora, I just got a call from Mrs. Hackney. She'd like to talk to you in her office. Now? I asked. Today? She nodded. That's what she said. I'll walk over with you, okay? I said, sure. Can I leave my things here, or should I bring them? Better bring them, she said, just to be sure they're safe. I grabbed my book bag and my jacket. My mind was zooming along at 1,000,000 miles an hour. This little talk with Mrs. Hackney wasn't in my plan. But so what, I said to myself. You knew something like this would happen sooner or later, right? So what if it's a whole lot sooner? No big deal. By the time we walked down to the principal's office, I had calmed myself down. No big deal, I told myself again. When the door opened, wrong. It was a big deal, a very big deal. My mom and dad were sitting at the large round conference table, and Mrs. Noyes, and Mrs. Zhang, and Mrs. Card, the music teacher, and Miss Prill, the art teacher, and Mr. McKay, the gym teacher, and Dr. Trindler, the guidance counselor. Mrs. Bryn followed me and took a seat next to Mrs. Noyes. And there they sat, all my teachers and my parents and the guidance counselor and the principal. Mrs. Hackney stood up and she smiled and nodded at me. I must have had an awful look on my face because she said, "Please don't be scared, Nora. This is a very friendly group. When your parents stopped in this morning, I decided it would be a good idea for all of us to get together and talk about your report card. Sorry to surprise you, but we didn't want you to worry about it all day because honestly, there's absolutely nothing to worry about. Please take a seat there between your mom and dad, and remember, we're all here because we care about you." Everyone was smiling and nodding at me as I sat down. I learned an important fact at that moment. Just because I'm really smart doesn't mean that I can't have a good old-fashioned panic attack. Okay, stop and write down what you thought about what just happened.